Live, where news comes first. This is ABC-7 Extra.
Good evening, I'm Maria Garcia. Tonight we're talking about the conversations that terribly tragic shooting in Charleston has forced our country to deal with and how to move forward. Police say this week 21-year-old Dylan Roof shot and killed 9 church members as they gathered for prayer service and Bible study in Charleston. Throughout the week, we've learned more details about those killed, some of their families showing awe-inspiring forgiveness toward the alleged killer. Law enforcement sources say Roof has confessed, and he said he wanted to start a race war. Pictures of him with a Confederate flag and weapons have emerged, and investigators are looking into a racist manifesto possibly written by Roof. Joining us tonight, Bishop Richard Johnson with Destiny Family Christian Center and Dr. Richard Pineda, Director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication and Associate Professor at UTEP. You can email us your comments and questions now to ABC7Extra at KVIA.com. You can also reach us at 915-496-1775 or tweet me at MariaGABC7. Before we get to our discussion, though, let's take a look at that emotional return to that church in Charleston 4 days ago, the scene of a massacre. Mother Emanuel's doors opening for Sunday service for the first time since that tragedy.
A lot of folk expected us to do something strange and to break out in a riot.
With the heat so thick they ran out of fans, white families joined black ones, filling the wooden pews of this historic African-American church.
It's a message that hate will not win. It will be love that has the victory.
I was drawn here to worship in solidarity with my brothers and sisters who are suffering.
It's like there's no color barrier. And you feel the sorrow, but you also feel the unity.
Hundreds more had to listen outside, rebuking the alleged murderer and racist accused of ending 9 lives in their Bible study room downstairs. Families and survivors of those who died are sharing more details about the murders at Emmanuel AME, saying that when he was done, accused gunman 21-year-old Dylan Roof tried to kill himself but failed.
He actually put the gun to his head, from what I was told, and pulled the trigger, and there was no bullets left.
Reverend Waltrina Middleton says she had to see the seat and take this photo where her cousin lost her life. In an emotional interview, she and the family of Ethel Lance told us not to get it confused. Not everyone's quite ready to forgive.
I know forgiveness is a process, and I know with God's help that I will get there, but I'm not there yet.
While police continue to look at what may be Roof's manifesto posted on the internet and the pictures of him at Confederate monuments, there's this moment of light online, a drawing from a 7-year-old girl outside Charleston. Being colorblind is awesome. You should give it a try.
And joining us now, Bishop Richard Johnson with Destiny Family Christian Center and Dr. Richard Pineda, Director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies and an Associate Professor at UTEP. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You know, there's a lot to talk about. I want to first talk about the victims, though, and the unity we saw there in that opening piece. The family of one of the victims telling Roof they forgive him. Another family saying they're not quite there yet. What are your thoughts on this? We'll start with you, Bishop.
Well, as a pastor, we're taught forgiveness. But understanding what forgiveness is, it doesn't mean that what you did was all right and would be allowed again. It's just saying I'm giving up my right to vengeance, trying to get back at you. And so it's a practice. It's easier said than done, but we are taught to forgive. And it releases you, really, of some of the pressure, the hate, the anger. But it's not saying it was all right. It's just saying I'm not going to exercise a right to get back to you or back at you.
And like you said, it's a practice, and I think it's also arguably a process.
It is a
right?
process.
A process of forgiveness. Dr. Pineda, when we hear media reports of the victims' family saying we forgive them, what does that do for the conversation for the country when you hear that?
Well, it's a remarkable thing, Maria. If you watch the sentencing hearing after Roof had been arrested and before he was sent back to Charleston, I mean, one of the things that was remarkable was that the victims' families were able to address him via closed-circuit television. The fact that they could, in that moment, embrace this notion of forgiveness is remarkable. I don't necessarily know that that has changed the national discussion. I don't think that it should. In some ways, I think that there's still a number of issues that are still in play, and one of them, I think, largely is the question of not having a vocabulary or vernacular to talk about race. And so I think that while there's certainly heavy hearts today in Charleston, I think that we're really only at the tip of the iceberg for this conversation, and I'm not entirely sure that we're that much better off to progress in that conversation. Absolutely, and I think when it comes to race, our country tends to be always at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to that. And I want to talk about that. There's been a lot of talk about mental illness, racism, how the media has reported the story. Let's talk about mental illness first. I mean, clearly Roof's actions are not those of a well-adjusted person, obviously here. But you hear people saying racism is not a mental illness. And I think that goes to your point, Dr. Pineda. Well, I think the tricky point is that this question of racism, and I think the bigger issue that's here, I think it's really easy to try to simplify it down, right? To make this an issue solely about mental health care, to make this an issue about gun control. All of those are important conversations, but I think what this points to, I mean, this particular incident, I think, is one of unfortunately quite a few that indicate that not only is there still racial tension in this country, but when it comes to how these things are acted out, the impact is devastating. I mean, there are people today who don't get to celebrate Father's Day with their parents because fathers were killed in Charleston. I think that the conversation needs to have some points where the discussion begins, but I think that means that people as a whole in the country have to acknowledge that this is a problem, and I think that we don't, and I think that that's a big part of the issue. And speaking of acknowledging it, Roof told the victims he had to do it because they were, quote, taking over. He wrote he wore pro-apartheid stickers. He said he wanted to, according to law enforcement sources, start a race war. I mean, clearly race is a factor here. And also, though, there's been this discussion that there's this refusal by some in the public, some in the media, to attribute this to race or to talk about race. Would we be talking about this differently if he were not white? What do you think about that, Bishop?
I do think race certainly is in the forefront of the conversation. But I also think mental illness has no color line. And so had he been a black young man or he's being a white young man, it's obvious he's mentally disturbed, right, and a dysfunctional individual. And so we don't know his history, but I do know dysfunction starts at a very young age, and I would think some of the thoughts and his pattern of thinking started well before 21 years old. He's been somehow instructed at a young age to have this hatred and this desire to see blacks killed and what have you. So it's definitely a mental situation, and I do think because of whatever upbringing he's had, race definitely was an issue here. Yeah, clearly.
Dr. Pineda, you and I have talked about this. We've talked about how really your experience in the media is catered to your ideological point of view, right? If you're conservative and you get online, all the articles that tend to pop up are conservative-oriented articles. You watch probably conservative-oriented network news. Vice versa if you're a liberal, too. So there's been a lot of discussion about, are we really having meaningful conversations about race, even about mental illness, or are people just kind of spewing off the latest they heard in their network news of choice, which caters to their point of view already, or just repeating, the meme on Facebook that popped up on their timeline that already caters and panders to their point of view?
Well, I think that there's two things. The first is that there definitely is a very segmented way in which people consume media, so that if you only want to seek certain kinds of messages, the way that digital media works in particular has really set that up. I think the other issue, and I think this is one that again needs to be part of a bigger conversation, is that I think what you're seeing is a radicalization of race conversations, especially on the internet. And so I think what you're seeing is spaces that are developing where hate groups are able to use this sort of digital interface in a way that hadn't been possible before. And so you not only have sort of a wide breadth of messages, but you also have an intellectualization of hate. So in other words, websites are developing a particular niche approach to how they cultivate racism. Different kinds of organizations have changed their names or have tried to find sort of more neutral space, and then they open up the conversation in the direction they want. I think that that's a really problematic issue, and I think that it's very, very hard in the same way it is to sort of confirm or disconfirm information on the internet. It's so much easier to hide this kind of vitriol, I think, online now more than ever before.
Speaking of cultivating racism, Bill Maher, who is admittedly left-wing, to say the least, blaming the right-wing media. He's saying media and how they present the world is to blame for really instigating some of these unstable individuals. Would you agree with that, Bishop?
Well, I'm sure there's some truth to it. I think it's more to it that these young men or women are being driven to such action. Of course, the media does emphasize that that's news. And some of it has been, you know, we've talked about the police department and what have you, and young black men being shot and without being armed and what have you. And all this incites certain emotions. So I think the media does play some part in it. But I think there's more behind their actions than just the news.
Okay, let's go to Jen in Central on the phone. Jen, what's your comment or your question?
Yes, my question is for Bishop Johnson. I just wanted to know what his point of view is as far as people using this as a race issue. Like, do you really believe that this has anything to do with race, or is it just America's way of trying to dumb down the situation? Okay.
So Jen is asking, are people using this as a race issue, or is America dumbing down the situation? What do you think?
The fact that the individual, the shooter, went to an AME church, and I'm told that he went there more than once, and his last day he sat in the congregation for an hour before going forth to kill. It's obvious that he went there to kill black people. Right. And that alone makes it a race issue. It's also obvious that the young man was demented, he had problems. But his actions and his the gear he wore, apartheid emblem on his coat and what have you, someone had put a lot of hate in his heart and in his mind, and I think that was the reason for his desire to kill, as he stated, black people.
Right, right. And you know, obviously there's a lot of things that this has, a lot of topics that this has really surfaced. Guns, violence, race, obviously, but as you said, the radicalization of hate, I want to talk about that. Millennials, young people, a generation that have grown up really exposed to the mass shootings, exposed to hate. You know, arguably you can say started with Columbine, and every year since, millennials, everyone actually on the news hears about mass shootings several times a year. And people scream for peace, but really I think a lot of the times don't do enough in their community to ensure it. So how do we do that? How do we ensure peace? How do we learn from this?
Well, I think that when we're talking about this question of people's perceptions and attitudes, you know, going back to the media perspective, so you have Bill Maher that takes a particular position about the story. Jon Stewart was devastatingly good this week in dealing with the issue, but what struck me watching those two programs and watching sort of the language that they use is those speak to audiences that are already pre-selected in terms of their belief set, right? So the audience for Jon Stewart, for Bill Maher, for the most part, are probably more to the left than they are conservative. So the question is then, where is this sort of middle ground, and where is this conversation that needs to happen that is nonpartisan, right? A conversation that people are engaged in. This isn't an isolated incident, and this isn't something that has just popped up in the last several years. I mean, we're talking literally of a history of racism in parts of the South that have not been addressed. And I think that it's easy to sort of isolate these different points. I think the question is, can we have a conversation about how to talk about race? And I think that's the first part, and that's the part that I don't think is really being framed. So,
but how do you do that? I mean, what platforms? How do you, as a community, do? Because it seems like every time something like this happens, you hear people saying we have to really talk about race. We have to first admit that it's a problem. We have to cross party lines, cross social lines. But on a practical level, how do you do that as a community?
Well, I think the first responsibility is for individuals themselves to stand up and have these conversations. It can't be a top-down approach, right? This has to happen with people having conversations with their neighbors, disconnecting to have a conversation about what goes on in their social spaces, having conversations with what goes on in their communities. If those things don't happen amongst individuals, people that are concerned about the future, talking to their children about these issues, making these issues that are important, especially when it comes to educating these children, then there's not going to be a conversation that happens at the level of the president or the level of Congress that's going to shift anybody's perceptions about race. I mean, these are conversations where the same people that are consuming media, especially when it comes to digital media or some of these other forms, if they're not connecting with the people around them, which I think is largely the case the further we go down this road, then you're not going to be able to have this kind of conversation. So it starts at that level. It starts at a micro level with people having those conversations, and only then can they start to move that up the chain, to talk to politicians, to talk to social leaders. I think otherwise what you're going to have again are a lot of people who are taking advantage of this for political or social reasons that are not necessarily reaching down to the people to have that kind of impact.
Okay, all right, we have to take a break. When we come back, a look at that polarizing symbol, the Confederate flag. Call us at 915-496-1775. Email us at ABC7Xtra@KVIA.com or tweet me at Maria G ABC7. You're watching ABC7 Extra, where news comes first. Welcome back. The debate over the Confederate flag still flying high on the grounds of South Carolina's state capitol landed right on Mother Emanuel's doorstep today, a sign outside the church calling on the governor to take the flag down. Here's ABC's Devin Dwyer on this polarizing symbol.
Tonight it's still flying high at the state capitol as calls to take it down grow louder. Take it down! The symbol of the Confederacy celebrated by accused racist killer Dylan Roof.
That flag gave his shooter and others like him a banner under which to justify their actions.
You can't separate the heritage from the hatred that is associated with it.
A debate expanding beyond South Carolina's borders to the 2016 campaign trail. Republican contender Jeb Bush saying he moved Florida's Confederate flag to a museum. Even Mitt Romney weighing in, tweeting, "Remove it now to honor Charleston's victims." President Obama replying, "Good point, Mitt." The only 2016 candidate from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, not taking a stance.
I welcome any debate and any discussion that will help my state and my nation.
Rick Santorum weighed in on ABC's This Week.
This is a decision that needs to be made here in South Carolina.
A state where pressure from outsiders is unwelcome.
Whether or not people have used it as a positive symbol or a negative symbol, it's still part of our history.
A symbol of Southern pride, long backed by a majority of South Carolina voters. Many now wondering if tragedy will change minds. Devin Dwyer, ABC News, Washington.
All right, we want to talk about that. Does the Confederate flag belong in public places? Can you separate its historic value from its racist heritage? What do you all think?
Well, I think it does symbolize a time and era that people of my race would like to put behind them. For those that feel like it's a historic thing that should be, the flag should be flown, I just say it incites certain emotions, and especially in the Carolinas where it's flown. I cannot say it being taken down is going to solve problems, but I do believe that it does symbolize a very trying and hurtful time in the lives of the Black America.
And we do have some comments from our viewers. Sergio saying it belongs in a museum, not inside a city hall. George David saying, why do we in the border still have Oñate stuff still around? So clearly, I mean, this is a conversation about, you know, these past historic symbols that have a lot of baggage to them.
Sure. Well, and I think that the other question is that whenever you talk about symbols that have not just a complicated past, but again are representative and can be easily connected to some very strong trends of racism, not only in the South and other parts of the United States, I think that symbolism is something that needs to be addressed head on. You know, when you see potential presidential candidates try to sidestep this as an issue, I think it begs the question of what they're afraid of talking about. And back to your point, I mean, if we're really supposed to have a conversation about race, it means that the conversation can't be sort of this sidestep that says, well, the people in South Carolina should make that decision. I mean, that's the beginning of the conversation.
That's what we heard
right?
Rick Santorum saying.
And I think that's problematic. I think if you don't have a conversation again about those things, and again, I mean, I think that the impact of the symbol goes far beyond just the notion of state pride or pride in the history of the South. I think that the layers of that conversation are another good place to start, because as you start to decode and get into the nature of the symbol, I think that conversation is again one of those places where, you know, to give you that sort of language, it's an on-ramp to a conversation that I think is important.
And Karen tweeting at us, the flag became popular when the KKK endorsed it as their own. It was never officially the flag of the Confederacy. Hashtag racism. Also, she's tweeting us, the admitted killer made it about race by premeditating a plot to, quote, kill black people, including a manifesto and a website. And from Rebecca, racism has been on everyone's mind this week with the shooting, but nobody has mentioned Donald Trump's racist remarks. Let's go to Lydia on the west side on the phone. Lydia, what's your comment or your question?
Let us compliment the leadership at Charleston for starting this conversation. The mayor, the senators at the federal level, there have been no riots. That's the beginning of this conversation now, that they're dealing with it in the appropriate manner. And so this is the beginning of the conversation. My compliments to the government in that, all the levels that have done such a great job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Do you agree with Lydia's comment, Bishop?
I think they've handled it quite well. The opposite result, I think, has happened. I think there was a horrible incident. I think it has kind of drawn people together in that area, both black and white and other races. And so I believe the way the mayor and the governor and those that spoke out has kind of united more than torn down. The words that they spoke were words of unity more than hate and anger. So I thought they handled it quite well.
The judge during Roof's hearing asked for sympathy for Roof's family. This really upset some people because they believe that his family is partially responsible for what he did and for his behavior. What do you think about that?
You know, I have a kind of particular point about the family. And now certainly, you know, they were not guilty of the act itself. But as I stated earlier, I think dysfunction starts very early, in the early age of a child. I think we as parents, this is being Father's Day, have some responsibility when we see our young person acting odd, doing things that seem to be destructive. I know it's hard for a parent to say my child is odd or different, but I think we have some responsibility to somehow approach the child when the child is in the room doing things of building bombs or whatever. It might not be a bomb, but something similar, or has paraphernalia of hate and Nazi language. I think parents have some responsibility to look into that and see where it's leading before it erupts into this kind of act.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, we're going to take more phone calls. Stay with us. You're watching ABC-7 Extra. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ABC-7 Extra. Let's go to Enrique in the Lower Valley on the phone. Hi, Enrique. What's your comment or your question?
Why in the city of El Paso, in the state of Texas, the issues talked about the use of guns when our own governor encourages the use for more guns? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, Texas is a very pro-gun state. You know, the legislature spent a lot of time talking about guns this session, open carry on campuses, when there's arguably a lot of other pressing issues. What are your thoughts on Enrique's question?
Well, I think Enrique's right. I mean, I think that this has become a politically palatable question for conservative politicians. I think that they get a lot of mileage out of talking about the need for more guns, and I think that that's problematic for a number of different reasons. I think that one of the difficulties, though, is that when it comes to this conversation about guns, I think that that's the sort of knee-jerk reaction, right? We need to talk about that, and then it becomes a political question that takes away, again, from this sort of core conversation. So I think one of the problems is that we're not going to resolve the question of access to firearms. I mean, that's not going to happen probably for, you know, decades. But again, I think that the conversation needs to be moved back to what prompts people to use them, and when there is access that's either illegal or that there's trading and sale of weapons that are underreported or under less government control, that's the issue. But again, I think it's problematic to make that sort of the core issue, because I think it lets people off the hook. It lets people off the hook to have these other conversations we've talked about.
Right. I mean, like you said, this issue is not going to be solved. This issue about access to guns is not going to really be addressed seemingly for decades. There's just not the political willpower. Obviously, there hasn't been the political willpower in the last 20 years to do this. So there has to be another conversation about it. What are your thoughts on that, Bishop?
You know, the word control is not a bad word. And though I don't have anywhere near the answer for the control, I do think control is necessary in some form. Everyone shouldn't be allowed to have certain type guns, automatic weapons and what have you. That needs to be questioned. Of course, background checks, and so the conversation is going to go on and on.
And the thing is, it just seems that you cannot have a conversation about guns in this country without it being heavily politicized. You just can't. It's just almost synonymous, you know, and so it's almost futile.
Well, I mean, it begs the question again about special interest politics, right? I mean, the reason that this conversation is hard to have is because you've got pretty active lobbying to prevent some of these kinds of limitations. But again, I mean, I think the conversation about firearms, I think, sort of moves us away from what I think are a bigger set of questions. Right. And I think that the more this happens, and I think that this will be some of the conversation you see as sort of a reaction to this. I think you're going to see politicians and you know, talking heads in the media sort of isolate these points, because it gets away from having what is an incredibly uncomfortable conversation about race, and you know, the media buzzword, I think, for the last several years of the Obama administration is that we're in a post-racial America. But an incident like this, I think, is nothing if a clarion call about the idea that we're not to that point. We are far from a post-racial society. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Bishop.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. P.
You're very welcome.
I appreciate it. And thank you for joining us here on ABC-7 Extra. We'll see you next week. We hope you found this informative.